Hello and welcome to Breaking Down History. I'm Dr. Dickens.
My name is Mr. Pritchard.
And today we're going to be looking at the question, who was the greatest Anglo-Saxon king? Now, before we even start this, we're going to need to have a think. Who were the Anglo-Saxons?
Right, well, the Anglo-Saxons, as I'm sure you're aware, most of you will have studied these people before, were a group of people, typically from Germany, who arrived in Britain after the Romans had left in about the 5th century. The Anglo-Saxons, once they had arrived in Britain, originally to help fight the Celts, began taking over the country, establishing themselves in different places, and eventually ruling the country, really, from about the sort of 7th, 8th century onwards. Once they ruled the country as well, they divided England up into lots of different kingdoms. Okay, and so the Anglo-Saxons, a sort of warrior group to begin with, then became the dominant group living in England.
Great. Now, I wonder, what sort of things are commonly known already about the Anglo-Saxons?
Right, well, what you probably would have studied before when you looked at the Anglo-Saxons were people like Alfred the Great, who we'll be looking at today. You'll probably also have learned about how the Anglo-Saxons started as pagans, so people that believed in lots of different gods and sort of old-fashioned Nordic gods, and then turned to Christianity from about 597. So when we're talking about them today, we're talking about the Anglo-Saxons very much as Christians. We also probably would know that the Anglo-Saxons spent a lot of time defending themselves from Viking attacks and from Viking raids. The Vikings started to come over from Scandinavia in around 789 AD, and they attacked churches and monasteries, they plundered the coast of England, they took slaves, they took gold, they took whatever they could get their hands on, really, and the Vikings are a big, important part of the Anglo-Saxon history as well.
Super. Right. Now, before we get started, let's have a quick think as well on how you can be taking notes in this podcast. So, what would you recommend, Mr. Pritchard?
I think what you've got to be doing for this is we're going to talk about 3 different Anglo-Saxon monarchs, 3 different kings. For each of these kings, what you could do is draw yourself a mind map or a spider diagram of the king, focusing on 3 different themes. So what you'll be able to see if you've got the video in front of you is, for your mind map, we're going to be looking at how strong each king was. We're going to be looking at how much each king changed England, and then also looking at the biography of that king. So what they did in their life, what are the key events, what shaped them as a ruler of England. Those are the 3 things you want to have on your mind map.
Now, the first Anglo-Saxon king we're going to be looking at is Alfred the Great. Now, actually, you'll all have studied Alfred the Great before. You'll have looked at him in your Year 7 history classes. So this is an opportunity for you just to recap what you already know before we tell you anything more. What I'd like to do is just pause the video now, and around your mind map, just add any information that you think you can remember or that you've got in your book already about Alfred the Great. Okay, so, Mr. Pritchard, who was Alfred the Great?
Well, Alfred the Great, he's the only king of his name in terms of having that nickname, the Great, the only king in English history to have that nickname, which says something about him already. He was the King of Wessex. He was from a royal family in Wessex, Wessex being one of the southern kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon world. And he became King of Wessex in 1871. The year before he was king, he was actually involved in a lot of battles with the Vikings. And it's really important to know that when Alfred becomes king, he inherits a kingdom that is being overrun by the Danes, by the Vikings.
Now, actually, what do the Danes really want from England at this time? What are they coming over to get?
Well, they, as we sort of said before, the Vikings and the Danes are coming to plunder, they're coming to steal. England was a very rich country in a lot of ways. It had lots of trade taking place here. The Vikings sometimes also stealing people, stealing slaves, or attacking the monasteries and churches where people would have worshipped. So the Vikings have been coming to England since the late 700s, but by 1871 they are really dominating the country. They have become further and further inland, and Alfred and the sort of people that he is ruling are struggling to deal with this threat from the Vikings. So that's what he spends the first sort of 7 years of his reign doing, fighting the Vikings. From 1871 to 1878, Alfred sort of makes his reputation as a warrior king, fighting back the Vikings, trying to push them out of Wessex. This all goes really wrong for him in 1878, right at the beginning of the year, where the Danes attack his palace in Chippenham in Wiltshire. As a result of this attack, Alfred is forced to go into hiding, and he spends the next sort of 6 to 8 months, supposedly, hiding in Somerset and trying to fight off the Vikings, but doing it purely by raiding them, not going to battle with them. This really changes at the Battle of Edington in 1878. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred defeated the Viking armies and stopped and pushed back the Danes in England. So this is really, really significant, really important. We've got the first really big defeat of the Vikings within the country. This in turn leads to a treaty called the Treaty of Wedmore, where the leader of the Vikings, Guthrum, and Alfred sat down and decided what they were going to do with the country now the Saxons had won this battle. And one of the things they decided they were going to do was they were going to divide the country into two. So if you have a look at the map that should be on the screen, you can see a country that is now divided in the north, you've got the Danelaw. This would be the land that was ruled by the Vikings in the north and in the east. And in the south and west, you've got the Saxon lands, okay, Wessex and Mercia. These were ruled by Alfred the Great. So Alfred the Great is gone from being king of Wessex to now ruling a much larger part of the country. One of the other things he does at this time is he manages to persuade Guthrum to convert to Christianity. So Guthrum, this Viking leader, becomes a Christian. And this is really important because actually, from this point onwards, you've got the Vikings becoming a more Christian group, more Christian set of tribes, to the point where by sort of 1066, pretty much all the Vikings were Christians.
So far, it seems like Alfred the Great succeeded in uniting England. He's brought different parts of England together, even though there's certain parts which are different to others. Because you said we've got the Danelaw and we've got the other parts. But he's created what looks like one country for the first time. And he's introduced really Christianity across the whole of the country because the Vikings, the Danes themselves, have converted to Christianity. Is that right?
Absolutely, and that was one of the things that Alfred was really passionate about. He was a really devout Christian. He was very serious about his religion, and he wanted to obviously spread it as people do when they are sort of very passionate about their faith. So he does successfully spread Christianity. One of the other things he does is he actually brings peace to England, a country that had been raided for so long by these different groups from Scandinavia, finds itself actually at peace for the next 8 years. And that's a remarkable thing for Anglo-Saxon England, to have that long period of peace. As well as that, he actually establishes a dynasty. So he has 5 children, and actually Alfred's children and his children's children and his sort of family rule the country with a small intermission up until 1066. So he establishes this really long family dynasty as well.
And just to be clear, a dynasty, a dynasty, that's a family which rules a country for a long period of time.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Now, that seems really impressive. But actually, if we take a step back, how strong would we say Alfred actually is?
Right, well, first off, the big thing, he successfully defeats the Vikings. He is the first British monarch to really not just defeat them, but actually push them back from where they were. This is not a one-off battle. The effects of this have a really big long-term consequence, a long-term significance. So he successfully defeats the Vikings. That makes him a strong ruler for sure. And as well as his success, he brings peace and wealth to England. As a result of England now being a more peaceful country, it's easier for trade to take place, it's easier for peasants to farm their land, there's a lot less worry about these raids, so England becomes more wealthy under him as well. He also builds 25 boroughs or burghs, some of these in Hastings, Oxford and London.
Now, hold on, before we go any further, what exactly is a burgh or
Well,
a borough?
If you have a look at your video again, guys, there'll be a picture, I should say, of one of these burghs. These are basically fortified towns, so towns that were enclosed by a wall that would have been protecting the country. Now, you can see with this type of fortification, whilst Alfred has defeated the Vikings, he's aware of the fact that the Vikings may attack again. So he builds these towns throughout the country as a way of protecting his people, but also protecting the trade that would have gone on within these different towns.
Very impressive. So he's building these burghs. This is protecting the people in England. Is he doing anything else which might protect them?
He also builds the navy. The British Navy, in terms of talking about the British Empire, is talked about one of the key things that leads Britain to becoming this global power. And King Alfred is often called the father of the British Navy. And that is to do with the fact that he establishes this navy, he builds lots of boats along the east coast of England, and these are really, really important in securing Britain's strength.
And we might actually want to think about why these would be so important at the time. Let's remember, Britain is an island, so if there's any foreign threat, are we right in saying it's going to come from overseas? You would need boats really to protect the country.
Absolutely, and what we know about the Vikings is they were a seafaring warrior group of people. Their boats had been terrorising the English coastline for over, sort of 100 years at this point. So the actual invention of a navy helped specifically protect against the Vikings.
Brilliant. Okay, so it looks like Alfred has really protected England. He's made it stronger. What does he actually change about the way that people are living their lives in England then?
So one of the things that Alfred does, and it's one of the reasons why we know so much about his life, is he really encourages literature and he really encourages reading and writing within the country. He invites, in 1885, a Celtic scholar, a Welsh monk called Asa, to come to England. And Asa taught Alfred how to speak Latin and helps him write a system of laws that were in place in the country. This is also really important because Asa goes on to write a book about Alfred's life. It's one of the reasons why, for the first time in the country's history, we know loads about this monarch. He also then, with this set of laws that he's established, travels around the country, making sure that people are following these laws, reviewing the different sheriffs and judges that would have been administering.
Why is that important?
Because it shows that he's a learned king, it shows that he's an educated king, and that he's also trying to use his education to better the lives of people through creating laws. He also was encouraging religion by building churches. He encouraged learning by creating laws that made it mandatory for freemen to learn English. So he does lots of things to encourage literature and reading and writing and really changes the way that the country behaved.
Now, the stuff that Alfred does to do with language, to do with English at the time, that seems to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things he does is, whilst he learns Latin, he makes sure that a lot of great books that are written in Latin are translated into Anglo-Saxon, which is an early version of English. So what you have for the next couple of 100 years is the language of Anglo-Saxon being used a lot more by monks and by scholars as a way of documenting what is going on within the country. So by promoting language, by promoting the Anglo-Saxon language, he actually, you could say, is a big part of the reason why English becomes a more important part of this country's history.
Okay, so we've taken a look at Alfred the Great, possibly the most famous of all the Anglo-Saxon kings, but he's not the only person we're going to take a look at. The next person is Athelstan. first off, who is Athelstan?
Athelstan, firstly, I should say, is my favourite of these Anglo-Saxon kings. I'm a little bit biased when it comes to talking about him. Athelstan was the grandson of Alfred the Great. So he's from the same family. He's inherited a lot of what Alfred had successfully achieved. He was born in 895 AD, and he was King of England from 924 to 939. So not quite as long as Alfred's reign, but still a very long reign for a king of the time. He was the first of his family who could read and write from childhood.
And I suppose this must have been quite important at this time, right? So most people in England at this time wouldn't have been able to read and write, certainly from a young age.
Absolutely. And I guess this also shows the impact that Alfred has had, the fact that Alfred has brought literacy into the country more. And as a result, now you've got kings being able to read and write from birth. And that's something that obviously continues after Athelstan as well. So he can read and write. He's very, very religious. So he's described as a devout king. And that comes from his ability to read the Bible as well. He takes religion very seriously. However, the key event from Athelstan's reign is the Battle of Brunanburh. And in order to understand Athelstan, we really need to have a look.
Okay, so in that case, what was the Battle of Brunanburh?
So in 937 AD, at the Battle of Brunanburh, King Athelstan, led a force drawn from Britain and defeated an invasion of Vikings and Celts from Scotland in alliance with the Welsh and Danes from Dublin. So he's defeating this incredibly big army that's come together to fight him. The Vikings' leader was Anlaf Guthrafsson, who was a pagan king from Ireland. He was the head of this grand alliance, drawing in people of Ireland and from northern Britain. And at Anlaf's side stood Constantine, the king of Scotland, whose daughter Anlaf had married. So there's this alliance based on marriage coming to defeat Athelstan. Both of them are worried about the power of King Athelstan of Wessex.
So just to recap, we've got this Viking leader, Anlaf Guthrafsson.
Yep.
We've got Constantine, the King of Scotland, and they're leading this big alliance, lots of different groups fighting together to come and attack England and to attack Athelstan. Why did these people invade England?
Well, if you remember when we were looking at Alfred the Great, and if you have a look at the map, it should be on your screen. When we were talking about Alfred the Great, we were talking about how Alfred divided the kingdom into two parts. So he divided England into his kingdom, but then also the Danelaw. And the Danelaw was obviously ruled by Vikings. However, Athelstan had invaded the north, had invaded the Danelaw in about 927 and had taken the city of York, but also most of northern England from the Danes. So he's actually successfully conquered a large part of England, yeah.
So those people in the Danelaw, they're going to be pretty unhappy that he's come in and he's starting to take over what they saw as their land, their territory.
Absolutely, and importantly as well, he has kicked out some Danes and some Vikings have fled, and these Vikings and Danes were related to Anlaf Guthrafsson, who is at this point in time the king of parts of Ireland. So you've got people in Ireland being angry about what they saw as their land and their relatives being mistreated by King Athelstan. So he conquers the north, and that you can't understate this. He's the first king, Anglo-Saxon king, to truly conquer all of England, to the point where he actually has coinage to show that he is now the king of all of Britain, and that is really, really important.
And we're talking there about money, aren't we?
Yes, yes. So on his coins, he had symbols of him wearing a crown, but also phrases that everyone would have seen. So everyone would have known, this is our king, this is the king of Britain. And once he has conquered the north of England, he forces all the other kings of the Britain to submit to him. So he says to the kings of Scotland and the kings of Wales that they can stay as king, but they have to pay him money, that they have to admit that he is their overlord, that he is the one sort of true king that has power over the rest of them. And in order to enforce his supremacy, in order to show off his power, one of the things Athelstan does is he invades Scotland in 934. And he invades it by land and sea, and goes as far north as Moray and Caithness. Okay, now this is really important because again, even in the Roman times, it's been very, very difficult for rulers from southern Britain to get that far north into Scotland. So he's invading Scotland, he's forcing the Welsh to pay large tributes, so large amounts of money, and he also eliminates lots of opposition in Cornwall.
Now, all of this happens before the Battle of Brunanburh takes place. So does this explain why the Battle of Brunanburh has to happen?
Absolutely. You've got basically Athelstan showing the rest of Britain just how powerful he is, and some people accepting that, but King Constantine of Scotland being not one of those people. He absolutely rejected the idea of Athelstan's power, and he found that it was too much for him to stomach. So that is why in the summer of 937, Alfred and Constantine launched their great allied invasion. But Athelstan wins. He wins this incredible battle, and it's said to be the biggest battle in the country before the Battle of Hastings, before 1066.
Wow.
Where there are supposedly 7 different kings fighting at this battle, 5 of which were killed during the battle as well. You've got potentially tens of thousands of people being killed, according to some of the Scottish sources anyway. So huge death, to the point where people in Britain are calling this the Great War for years afterwards. And this obviously shows Athelstan's power.
Wow.
So he dies in 939 AD. He conquers all of England, and to some extent all of Britain, and then 2 years later dies at the height of his power, having done all of this work, and he's buried in Malmesbury Abbey, okay, which was a church that he'd helped build himself with money he devoted to the Christian faith.
So we've got this incredible story. We've got a king who's done some really quite remarkable things, not only in England, but also in Britain. But if we take a step back, let's ask ourselves again that question. How strong is this king? How strong is Athelstan?
Well, some historians have said that if we're looking at it in terms of power, Athelstan is probably the most powerful ruler of Britain. So not just England, but Scotland and Wales as well. The most powerful ruler of Britain since the Romans had left. That's incredible for one man to have wielded that much power.
And that's for over 500 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. He's also shown his ability as a soldier. That's so important to kings of the time, to not just be able to lead a country, but to also be able to defend your country, as he does at this battle, and also invade if you need to as well. He makes alliances with the Welsh. He establishes a very strict border between the two. He gets them to pay money to him, so he's showing how really powerful he is by the fact that these other kings are just submitting to him, are giving him money. As well as his alliances he makes within Britain, Athelstan is one of the first kings that makes allies across Europe. So he marries lots of his daughters and sisters off to kings around the continent, and many foreign rulers sent him gifts. Poets came to sing his praises. Foreign diplomats visit him. He's really sort of a European, I guess, famous king at this point in time. He's well known across the continent.
So that would suggest then that he's got respect not only from people in England and Scotland and Wales, but also from across the whole of Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. The gifts and the marriages helps consolidate his power.
Yeah.
And as well as that, similar to Alfred, through this defeat, he actually does establish peace. There is peace in the country as a result of him defeating his enemies.
So going back to that question from before, why does all of this actually make him powerful?
Because he has shown his dominance, because he has shown his military power, but he also shown how he is admired throughout the Christian world. He's built alliances. He's basically built England into this much more powerful kingdom than the one he inherited. And I think that's the key thing here.
Okay, now if we went back to the reign of Athelstan, what sort of changes would we have seen taking place in England at that time?
Now, it's fair to say there are less changes than Alfred administered. He doesn't change England in quite as dramatic a way. However, he still brings peace and unity to the country. This ability to unite different parts of the country is a huge change. He creates laws that strengthen his control over the country. Remember, that previously the Danish, the Vikings, have ruled a different part of the country. They'd had their own laws, and Athelstan establishes one set of laws that works across the entire country. And that's a massive change as well. He also really takes a sort of keen interest in currency, so he produces lots of coins. He penalises people that counterfeit and commit fraud by creating their own coins. And he also encourages town life. Trade in the burhs becomes a lot more successful as well.
And these are the burhs that Alfred has already built up before him.
Absolutely. So, not quite maybe as much change as Alfred the Great, but at the same time, he has definitely brought a lot of bigger changes maybe in terms of the way the country looks.
And outside of the burhs, are there any other things that change, any other developments that happen?
Yes, so outside of the burhs, he also changes the way the sort of countryside looks, especially in the parts that have been ruled by the Danes and the Vikings, and consolidates a lot of the life into what are called shires, and changes lots of things to do with that as well. Also puts a lot of money into the church, similar to Alfred, has lots of churches built in his name. That's often the king's way of showing how serious they were about religion, but also how sorry that they were for killing people in battle.
Wow, very impressive. Okay, so far we've taken a look at Alfred the Great, we've taken a look at Athelstan. Now, as we've been doing that, hopefully you'll have been adding to your mind maps. So you should have notes about both Alfred the Great and Athelstan already. And that's going to be really important because we're moving on to our third and final Anglo-Saxon king, Edgar the Peaceful. And as we're doing Edgar the Peaceful, just like you have done for Alfred the Great and for Athelstan, you're going to need to be adding to your mind map as well. Okay, so first off, who is Edgar the Peaceful?
So Edgar the Peaceful, he's born in 942, still part of that dynasty that Alfred the Great had established, and he becomes king of Mercia and Northumbria in 957, then becomes king of Wessex as well in 959. So by 959, he is a king of a sort of united England. He's only 16 by the time he becomes king, which is very, very young, even for that time. Now, Edgar doesn't necessarily go out and start lots of battles, invade lots of different countries. As you can guess from his name, Edgar the Peaceful, one of the things that is known about his reign is how much peace there was within the country. So the fact that actually there weren't many wars or any real wars that took place, and that he really sort of united the country, building on the work that Athelstan and Alfred had done in conquering different parts of the country as well. So he is crowned king of all Britain in Bath in 973. And this coronation, so when the crown is put on his head and he has an archbishop declaring him king, this is a really important coronation because this ceremony would be something that would be replicated by later kings, really right up until the modern day. Edgar is the first person to be really officially pronounced as king of all Britain. And he does this, and he is king of all Britain, up until his death 2 years later in 975. So he's king for a fair amount of time. Also, when he is crowned as king of Britain, one of the things that happens is 8 of the Celtic kings, so these are kings that would have been in Scotland or in Wales or in Cumbria, they come south to Edgar's coronation, and they actually put Edgar into a boat, and 8 of these kings row him across the River Dee.
So just to get this clear, Edgar has sat himself down in a rowing boat, and these 8 other kings from all around Britain, they've got in the boat with him. He's sat there, he's not doing anything, but they are rowing the boat with him in it across the river. What on earth does that mean?
Well, obviously, Edgar does not need this to happen. He doesn't need these people to take him across the river, but it's a sort of gesture. It's a symbolic gesture. So it's the kings showing to Edgar that they support him, that they are willing to work for him, and that he is their true king. Even though these men themselves would have had lots of power, would have been incredibly important people, wealthy people in their own regions, they're showing Edgar that he is the sort of dominant ruler within Britain. And that's really important.
I suppose rowing someone across a river, that's almost the sort of thing that you would expect a servant to do to their lord or their master.
Exactly, and I guess that's what they're showing here, that they're ready to serve the king. Okay, as well as that, sort of something that maybe should be mentioned, Edgar was a very small man. Okay, he's constantly talked about being potentially less than 5 feet tall, but however, having this really strong magnetism. So people being drawn to him, being a really strong personality, and also being described by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as being very handsome and someone who achieved a lot.
How important is that, do you think, that you would have an Anglo-Saxon king who's very handsome?
Well, I guess the key thing that it helps with is people being drawn to him, people liking him. The same way that being good looking tends to help you in life, I guess.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but so he has this sort of these good looks, has this personal aura to him, and all of this stuff, not obviously his good looks alone, but it allows him to keep peace in the country. In particular, Edgar manages to keep peace in the lands that had previously been owned by the Vikings, so in that land, the Danelaw. And he does this by not really interfering too much with what's going on there. He also, really importantly, recalls someone called Dunstan, who he makes Archbishop of Canterbury, so the head of the English Church. Dunstan was a really important person for the time who reformed Christianity in England. So he got rid of a lot of the problems that had been facing the church, got rid of a lot of the corruption, and later gets made a saint. And it's Edgar who brings Dunstan back into the fold, brings him back into the country.
So what we're saying there is that he has a really important role in changing the way that Christianity works in Britain, and perhaps making people have a bit more trust and a bit more faith in the most important people in the church.
Absolutely, yeah. Dunstan is a huge positive influence on the church. He gets rid of a lot of, and quite harshly, but gets rid of a lot of priests that had been stealing from the church or doing things that they really shouldn't have been doing.
Okay, right. Now, all of that seems quite impressive, but overall, how strong was Edgar, do we think?
So his reign is often seen as a golden age because pretty much his entire reign, there is peace. It gets talked about as this golden age.
Right, hold on. Before we go any further, that's a really powerful phrase, a golden age. What does that actually mean?
So a time where, I guess you could say, everything's good. There is people are at peace, people are able to make money, culture is thriving, so lots of buildings are, like churches are being built, for example. There's lots of stuff happening that is making the country richer, not just in terms of money, but also just a richer place to live.
Yeah, fantastic.
So it's seen as a golden age, and unlike Athelstan, he is crowned king of all England. He's got that strength there. The fact that he's rowed across the River Dee by these other kings as well shows how his Saxon kingdom is much more powerful than the other Celtic kingdoms around it as well. So he's still a strong military king, even if he doesn't have to use that military power. The other thing he does, and this is again building on something Alfred the Great has done, is he builds up the navy. If you remember, we said that Alfred was seen as the sort of father of the British Navy. Edgar actually builds the navy up to an incredible level, to the point that people say there are up to 3,600 ships that had been built by the time of his death and are protecting the English shores from the Vikings.
And that's going to be really important again, because we can remind ourselves that obviously Britain is an island, and anyone who's going to be attacking from outside the country, they're going to be coming over by ship, aren't they?
Absolutely. And whilst we've talked about the Vikings being defeated by Athelstan and being defeated by Alfred, they didn't just go away. Every Viking sort of ruler in some way or another raided countries, and Britain continued to be raided right up until sort of 1066.
Okay, super. So overall, how far did Edgar change England, do you think?
There's less change in comparison with other countries. So he doesn't necessarily make the same changes that Alfred and Athelstan does, but he does encourage the building of lots of new religious churches and monasteries. And also, by the end of his reign, England has become this very peaceful and prosperous place.
Right, now we've looked at those 3 Anglo-Saxon kings. Now, Mr. Pritchard, I've been asking you all the questions so far.
Yep.
So why don't we flip it on its head? Why don't you ask me some questions to wrap this all up?
Yeah, I think I've been talking for long enough. So what we're going to focus on, that big question from the beginning is, who was the greatest Anglo-Saxon king? We've looked at 3 different kings. Who do you think is the greatest of the 3?
What a difficult question, because if we look at it, we've got Alfred the Great, right, who effectively beats the Vikings, and you've got people who are still Vikings or of Viking descent who stay in England, but he's the one who first defeats them in battle. So that makes him pretty great, I think. We've got Athelstan, and Athelstan goes even further, really, than Alfred the Great, because he starts to unite the whole of Britain, doesn't he? Which is, I think, really impressive. And then we've got Edgar the Peaceful, and I suppose the clue's in the name, isn't it? Edgar the Peaceful is the person who turns Britain into a more peaceful place during his reign. So they all seem really, really potentially important kings. I suppose I would have to say, because it's the start of all of these changes, because he's the person who allows all of these other developments to happen after him, probably have to say I'm most impressed by Alfred the Great.
Right, so you're saying because he's sort of led the way for these other kings, he's maybe the most impressive of the 3.
Yeah, absolutely, because if we think about it, if Alfred the Great hadn't defeated the Vikings, then realistically, could Athelstan have started to take over the rest of Britain? Unlikely. And if Athelstan hadn't been able to do that, could Edgar have ruled over a relatively peaceful Britain?
If we're going to just flip that question ever so slightly, if you were someone who was living in England during this time, which of those 3 kings do you think you would have preferred to live under?
That's a really, really good question. If we go through each of the kings, I think Alfred the Great, that would have been a time of lots of fighting, lots of bloodshed. I think that would have been quite a difficult time to live in England. And probably the same with Athelstan, because of course he's fighting against these different Irish and Scottish kings at different times. Edgar the Peaceful, I think life's probably best under him, I would guess.
So I guess it comes back to this sort of idea of how do we judge who was a great Anglo-Saxon king? What is it about? Is it about how strong you were? Is it about how much you changed the country? Is it about how sort of peaceful your reign was? And that is the thing that we're going to get you to think about in next week's task, where we're going to get you to sort of write your judgment on who you think the greatest Anglo-Saxon king was. It might be that you have researched another Anglo-Saxon king you think is better than the 3 we've talked about today. The other thing that I'd really like you guys to go and do is, we've talked about Anglo-Saxon kings. If you are interested, as you should be, there is a woman, or not a queen, but she was called the Lady of Mercia, Ethelfleda, and she is an incredible woman from this age who fought lots of battles, who had a really interesting story and had lots of power, and it's really worth researching if you're interested in the Anglo-Saxons. So have a look for next week's task. Make sure you're sort of making a sort of judgment yourself about who you think was the greatest Anglo-Saxon king. And yeah, we'll speak to you soon.
Fantastic, great, thank you very much.